I see that almost everybody's muted, so I really appreciate that, folks. It's hard to speak if people have background noise, so appreciate that. Yeah, tonight we're going to look at a bunch of questions that you can use to evaluate images, both your own images and other people's images. And for some time now, I've been a member of 3 different critiquing groups that meet regularly. And the feedback that I've heard in those groups, both about my own work and about the other work that's brought to the group, have been a huge factor in my success as a photographer. One of those groups is a SIG, a special interest group within our club here. And I've been leading that for 7 or 8 years. And over half the people in that SIG have been part of it for that whole time. And I think any one of them would tell you that the critique they've received in that group has really helped them to develop a more discerning eye and improve their work. So as Arif mentioned, I'm going to give you a checklist that you can use that has all the questions on it, but there may be some other things that you want to note down as we go along. And if there are screens where you want to take a screenshot to get a bunch of points, there aren't too many slides like that, feel free to do that. So not all photographs need to be critiqued. I'm not suggesting that you need to do a deep critique of every picture you take. Sometimes we just shoot for fun and memories. And this is just a snapshot of my husband and our granddaughter, our only grandchild. And it's so precious to me. It's one that's just for me and my family. It makes me happy. I don't care to critique it. There's a lot of things wrong with this as a photograph, but that's not the point of this particular photo. So we don't have to critique all of our work. It's just for fun, this one, and to preserve a really wonderful memory. But if you're really serious about your work, or you want to be helpful to other people who might ask you for feedback, then you do need to understand how to critique. And I think it's a very valuable skill. So, later this year, you're going to be asked to vote for images in our club competitions. And my own view is that should not be a popularity contest. It should not be a matter of what picture do you like. It should be a matter where you know how to critique an image and evaluate it as a photograph. And I think this presentation tonight will help you develop that skill. So here's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to start by talking about how to critique your own photos and the criteria to use in evaluating those. We'll talk about what to look for in your images to improve them. And there'll be some overlap with what you want to look for when you're taking an image, of course, because the two go together. There are principles of visual design that we can use, but there's also an element of subjectivity in critiquing. For every principle that we learn about how to compose a photograph well, there's also a time to disregard that principle in the service of our vision. I think the key is to be true to your vision and know when to use or disregard the visual principles that we learn as photographers. Photography is a visual language, and like any language, the more fluent you are, the better you're going to be able to craft an image that really expresses what you want to say. So that's going to be the bulk of tonight. And then we're also going to talk about how to give feedback to other people and how to receive and use feedback that's offered to you. And I think those 3 aspects, learning those 3 things, will go a long way towards helping you become the very best photographer that you can be. So starting with critiquing our own photos, we want to pay attention to what works and what could be better. We want to give ourselves credit for what we do well, but always be pushing for how we could become even better. So this shot that I took in 2015 is not a bad shot. It's sharp where it needs to be. The soft backlighting works to show the patterns in the leaves, but it lacks anything special, any kind of emotional impact. It's just a pretty ordinary photograph. And, sometimes I get initially excited about an image, but when I really get down to it, it doesn't quite say what I wanted to say. And I have to admit that to myself and try again. This from 2017, I think, is better than the other one. I think what works in this image is the color, the contrast, the detail are all excellent, but there are some things that could be better. I could have used a polarizing filter to reduce the glare, and I've learned from this image, and I now do that when I'm shooting foliage. And if I were shooting this again, I would rotate that lower left leaf so that the stem formed a leading line into the picture from the bottom left corner. So I'm always learning, critiquing my own work, what works, what doesn't, and learning from it. 2 years later, here I've applied what I've learned through my own critique and that's been given to me by others. And I'm pretty happy with this one. I think this is an image that communicates what I was actually trying to say. Now, you may or may not like the image, but that's really beside the point. Forget about likes and pleasing others. And really, I encourage you to aim to create images that say what you want to say as clearly and effectively as you can. So I'm starting tonight with some of my own images, but a lot of the images that I'm going to show you tonight are not mine. They've been gathered from social media to illustrate some important points that you'll want to keep in mind as you critique your images. And I'll try to remember to tell you which are mine and which are not. Some of them are credited when I know the person who took them. So here's the first question when you're going down the list of questions and evaluating your image. You want to start with the big picture before you launch into looking at the smaller details. First impression is really important, and you need to ask yourself, does my image have emotional impact? Is it a wow image or is it a meh image? And of course, that's different for different viewers, but be honest with yourself. Is it a wow or a meh for you? One of the critique groups that I belong to is a group of fine art photographers, and we meet every single week to critique for an hour and then also to have a guest speaker for an hour. And our guest speakers are pretty amazing people. They're brand ambassadors, National Geographic photographers, and very famous teachers. And one of them even recently had the Time magazine cover photo of the Lahaina fire. So you know what kind of stature these people have. And one of the questions we always ask every speaker is, what are the top 3 factors that you consider when you're evaluating an image by somebody else? And every one of those speakers has listed in the top 3 emotional impact, and most of them put it first. So, this image, I think, has a very quiet and peaceful kind of emotional impact. It relaxes me and makes me feel peaceful. This image has quite a different emotional impact. And, we're all different, and we all bring our own personalities and our own life experiences to both making images and viewing images. And what I like, you may not like, and that's fine. This one, another kind of emotional impact. For me here, there's a feeling of peace and mystery. Whereas here, the feeling is more of tenderness. These kinds of photographs touch my heart. They may not do the same for you, but they really move my heart. And I tend to work with subjects that move my heart, and then I try to craft images that will move my viewer's heart. For me, that's what photography is all about. It may be different for you, but for me, that's where it's at. Here, the emotion is more about wildness and mystery and perhaps even danger. And not all photographs have to be beautiful. An image can be emotionally powerful without the emotion being a positive one. I actually made this abstract image after hearing about the horrible fires in Maui, and I titled it No Way Out. It's not a pretty image, and it's not one I'd ever want to hang on my wall, but I think it does have emotional power. Now, when I got back into photography after a hiatus of several decades, one of the things I learned was every photograph should have a story, and that confused me, because the kind of photography I do isn't story oriented. I think street photography and travel photography, photojournalism, wildlife, even landscapes may have a story. But a lot of the things I do, things like macro and flower photography, it's still life, even astrophotography, those don't necessarily have or need a story. I think images can be about emotions and themes, not just stories. So when you look at your image, ask yourself, is there a story here, or is there a feeling or a theme associated with this? In this image, I think this one has a story. And while we can't know for sure what the story is, the image does invite us to make up a story, a narrative. But there's also emotion here. Here's one that I don't think really has a story, but it has emotion and a theme. It's more of a chaotic feeling. It's kind of a jarring image. This is part of a series I'm working on addiction. I don't know why I'm getting blank slides in here, folks. I apologize for that. This sunflower shot, I think, has emotion, and it has a theme around aging and mortality, grief, those kinds of things. So when you ask yourself, or you hear somebody say your image needs to have a story, think, yeah, maybe a story, or maybe an emotion or a theme, but it needs to have something like that in it. Then ask yourself, what was my intention? Why did I take this photograph? What was I trying to say? And does that come through? You can't communicate clearly in a visual language or any language, really, if you don't know what you want to say in the first place. So get clear in your own mind about that before you click the shutter. I've even heard of people sitting down and writing about the images they're going to take before they take them. So, for example, if you love photographing car races, you might write down before you go to the car race, why do you like photographing car races? What is it that captures you about that? What do you get excited about? And then those are the things that you want to say or convey with your images. So we're going to look at some social media images. And the first question I have with those is, does everything in the frame contribute to making it a strong image? Are there distractions in the frame? Would the composition be stronger if you'd left some things out? Can you do anything about that in post, or do you need to compose better the next time you shoot? Think about it like watching a movie. If you were watching a movie, you'd become very annoyed if there were all kinds of people and things scattered around in the movie that had absolutely nothing to do with the plot. Photos are like that. You don't want anything in the frame that doesn't support the point of the image. So here's an image from Facebook. It was posted very recently. Does everything in the frame contribute? No. There's a little bright piece of foliage sticking in from the right-hand side there with the circle around it that would have taken literally 2 seconds to remove in post. But often we don't see these things because we don't look at our photographs critically and analytically to evaluate what works and what doesn't. Clearly in this image, that little piece sticking in doesn't work, and it would take zero effort almost to get rid of it. Another question, what is the subject? In most images, you want to have a strong center of interest. You want to have a clearly identifiable subject. And I say most because there's exceptions to everything I say tonight. Again, think of it like a movie. We need to have the main character and supporting characters and not a bunch of people unrelated to the plot. So in this image, that again is from social media, I think there's a powerful story here, but it gets lost because there's so many distractions in the frame. The overall impression is just clutter and disorganization. The subject is not clear. If the image had simply showed the shoes outside the door, then I think it would have been far more powerful. And of course, the photographer would have been smart to stand on the other side of that tree that's sticking up right here to eliminate that distraction and the branch in the lower left corner. With that improved composition and some appropriate post-processing, I think it could have been much more powerful. Unfortunately, this photographer has also allowed the camera to take control of the focusing, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. And so the camera chose to focus on this tree, and the actual subject is out of focus. So before you press the shutter, ask yourself, what do I want to say with this image? And what do I need to have in the frame to say that? So here's another example from social media. What is the subject? Is it the sky? Is it the land? Composed like this, those two elements compete, and we're left kind of adrift and not knowing what we're supposed to look at. It's a very common mistake in beginners to include too much in the frame. Think about it. If everything in the frame is equal, then nothing stands out. And we're left wondering what the photographer was trying to say. So decide what you're really drawn to and then make that the center of interest. Another image from online. There's some beautiful things in this image, beautiful tones, very striking shapes, patterns, contrasts, a lot of things that do work here, but there's way too many focal points. We don't know what the subject is. Our eye doesn't know where to go. If we divide this image up into some of its components, then we know where to look. And so the image is much stronger. And symmetry is very attractive in this kind of subject. And there's more images in here, and we need to train ourselves to see these things when we're shooting and frame our shots accordingly. And we can also remove people if we want to, either by shooting long exposures or multiple exposures and then blending them in post, or even just using a heal tool to get rid of the people. And sometimes you want the people because they add to the story. Now, here's one of my, those of you who are in my critique group know, you're going to be smiling because this is one of my pet peeves, is your horizon level. Our eyes are really sensitive to this. Even a slight tilt of a degree or two is going to be noticeable. And you might not say, oh, the horizon's not level, but you're just going to feel kind of off about the image. It's just not going to feel quite right. So use the level in your camera or your tripod or your software and make sure your horizon is level. Now, there are times to not do this. There is a thing called a Dutch tilt that's used for special effects, but it's an exaggerated tilt to the horizon done for effect. Having the horizon just a little bit off like this is just disorienting. When you level it, the image just feels so much better. And to go with that, are your verticals upright? This is a photograph that I took in New Brunswick. When you shoot buildings, depending on the lens that you use, you may have verticals that converge. And you'll get more of that with a wide angle lens than you will with a longer lens. And of course, if your camera isn't completely level, then your verticals are going to be off. So normally you want things that are vertical to be vertical in the frame. So check that when you're going down your checklist of evaluating your photograph, check the verticals. It's really easy to correct in post. You want to check for sensor dust spots and lens flare. I've circled some dust spots here that I don't know if you can see them. Depends on the size of your screen, probably. And then down to the left of the bike, there's a lens flare. Areas of sky and other areas with very little detail really show dust spots and flare. So always go through your photographs and check them at 100% size and check for those things. Now, lens flare seems to be somewhat fashionable these days, but there's good ways and bad ways to use it. This is clearly not an intentional lens flare. You can avoid lens flare by using a lens hood, or an even better tip that was shared with me by Andre Gallant in a workshop I did with him and Freeman Patterson, is get yourself a black umbrella and hold it up between the sun and the lens so that no sunlight falls directly on the lens. And that will really get rid of your lens flare. Another question, are there things in the frame that draw the eye away from the subject? Now, all of these things, brightness, contrast, sharpness, bright warm colors, faces and human forms, numbers and letters, all of these elements will draw the eye. And now if they're part of your subject, they help the composition because they draw the viewer's eye where you want it to go. But if they're in an area that draws the eye away from where you want the viewer to concentrate their attention, then that works against the image. So especially do what I call border patrol. Any of these elements along the edges of your frame are going to pull the viewer's eye out of the image. So here's an image that I took a few years ago. And when I looked at this carefully, I thought, okay, it's not a spectacular image by any means, but the one big flaw in this image for me is that this leaf right on the upper edge is tack sharp. That is not where I want my viewer to look. I want my viewer to look at the flower. And so I looked at that and I thought, well, I'm at my skill level with post-processing, I'm not going to be able to get rid of that. Maybe I could today, but I just thought this image is not worth keeping except for teaching purposes. Here's a photo that was brought to the critique SIG that I've been in for such a long time. And the photographer who took this liked it, but he wasn't quite satisfied with it. And we can see some things here that really do work. It's an attractive color palette. The layering of the forest and the mountains creates a feeling of depth. And that's what really drew him in. But as we worked with it in the SIG, we were able to spot some things that could have been done better. So there's some distractions here. There's sensor dust in the sky, and there's some towers and some lights in the foreground that create small areas of contrast. And we know that areas of contrast they draw the eye. And in this case, they weren't adding to the image. We also know that areas of brightness and saturated color draw the eye. So the water here is distracting away from the layers of the landscape. And in the SIG that I lead, we often will actually work with an image in Lightroom and actually make some modifications so that the photographer who brought the image can see what the suggestions would contribute and decide whether they like them or not. So we removed the sensor dust, we cloned out the towers and the lights in the foreground, and then we cropped out the water to get rid of that brightness, and most of the sky, because the sky really wasn't the story, the land was the story. And the photographer who brought the image was much happier with it, with these changes. This was what he loved in the first place. This is what he was drawn to, and what he wanted to show the viewer. And of course, if he hadn't liked what we did in the critique, he could have disregarded our suggestions. They're only suggestions. This is, again, not my image. It's from the internet, and it was shot and submitted for a chicken marketing job, which I thought was kind of interesting. And again, there are some things here that work. The subject is sharp. It's placed off center, which works well with the birds looking into the frame for a nice balance. That all works. But the brightness and contrast in the upper right part of the frame draw the eye away from the subject. And by cropping that distraction out at the top, it keeps our attention on the subject. So whenever possible, of course, you want to compose in camera to eliminate distractions. Sometimes you need to do a bit of cleanup or cropping in post. Another question for you. Do you really need all that sky? Sky can be a distraction unless it's a really important part of what you're trying to say. So if it doesn't contribute, get rid of it. And I remember how shocking this idea was to me. Probably shouldn't have been, but every once in a while I hire a photography coach to work with me and help me improve my work. And years ago, I had hired Sharon Milstein, who's a garden photographer on, I think it's Hornby Island. And she was coaching me, and we were looking at pictures. She said, Judy, you really don't have to include the sky in every photograph, you know. And I went, oh yeah, I guess I don't. And so I found that was a really quick way to improve my work, was asking myself, do I really need all that sky? And in this image, I think it's also a good idea to correct the verticals. And when we do that, now the image is all about the girl. There's still context there, but it's a much more engaging and much more personal image. Here again, we have a lot of blank sky. Over a third of the frame is just blank sky. But what is the photo really about? Why do you think the photographer took it? Well, I expect this is what drew the photographer in, and this is what he or she wanted to say. So again, do your cropping in camera when you can, as much as you can. And if you need to crop when you get into post, then you do that. Next question to ask yourself is the image sharp where it needs to be? This photographer has got a really nice expression, and I think the unusual angle that she has the subject at is interesting. But in a portrait, it's critical to have the eyes in focus. Now, this camera has picked up the tattoo and put it in focus instead of the eyes. And so that's a major flaw here. If you set your camera to use all of its focus points, what that means is you're actually giving the camera permission to decide what should be in focus instead of you deciding what should be in focus. And most modern cameras, you can set all the focus points on, or a grouping of focus points, or just a single focus point. And I use the smallest possible focus point on my camera, and I place it exactly where I want the sharp area to be. And a lot of modern cameras also have eye detection, and that can be very helpful when you're working with portraits. So here, if I suspect that the photographer was using all the focus points and the camera saw the area of contrast where the tattoo is and said, oh, that must be what she wants in focus, and went ahead and did that. Also in this image, the background could be cleaner. If the photographer had chosen to darken it down a bit more, maybe desaturate it a bit, apply a blur, that all would have helped. And of course, even better would be to move the subject to a better place where their background is cleaner. So you do need to ask yourself, does the background detract from the image? Again, here we've got a nice subject with a good expression. She's in focus and she's offset in the frame. All those things work. The photographer got down to her eye level, which is really a good point of view for this kind of shot, and used appropriate depth of field and focus. That all works in this image. But most of the time, again, you don't want your background to draw attention away from the subject. So this background is bright and cluttered and busy. The backlighting is nice, but the photographer could have pulled the exposure down and used a reflector or an off-camera flash, or move to open shade to take this image. You know, the hair light looks really great, but they've overexposed the background in order to get enough detail in her body. So not the best way to do it. And remember, you don't always need a background. This is one of my shots from this summer of some sunflowers I was working with. And sometimes filling the frame can be very effective and you don't need any background at all. The next question on my checklist is, are your colors oversaturated? I often see photos that are oversaturated. And I think one of the reasons is that as we age, our eyes see color less vividly. I always wondered why my grandmother crocheted in such atrociously screaming colors. And now I know they weren't screaming colors to her. They looked normal to her. But because she was older, her eyes saw color differently. So it's really easy to oversaturate colors so they look right to us when we get older, but they scream at younger folks. And judges are particularly likely to mark you down if your background yellows and greens scream like this. And a tip for you, by the way, is if you're doing post-processing and you have the option of using a vibrance slider or a saturation slider, use the vibrance slider, because the vibrance slider only brings up the saturation on the colors that are not already saturated, whereas the saturation slider brings up all of the colors. And so I only use the saturation slider when I want to desaturate. And if I want to bump the colors up a bit, I only use the vibrance slider. So there's a tip that you might use to try to avoid the oversaturation issue. Next question is the perspective or the point of view effective? This is another shot from the internet. I think most beginning photographers tend to just shoot from their standing position. And so we get all these images that are from the photographer's eye view. But especially with kids and animals and things, you want to be at your subject's eye level most of the time. It makes a much more sort of personal shot where you're kind of more involved with the subject. So here's another internet shot. And this one, I think you can see, is much, much more effective because in part because the photographer got down to the dog's eye level. And now we feel like we're in relationship with the dogs. Here's a tip to keep in mind when you're photographing kids. Yeah, I'm showing off my granddaughter again in this crappy picture. The one thing that works in this image is the perspective. When you're photographing kids, if they're looking down at something they're playing with or a book they're reading, see if you can get lower than them so you're shooting up at their faces. And that will give you a much more personal kind of image. The standard view of flowers is top down. You know, we're standing and we look at the flower and it's below us and that's where we shoot it. I try to find an angle that gives a more personal view, as I did here. So I shot both of these basically at sort of stem level. And the second one here, I had worked with this flower for, I don't know, an hour or more, and I thought I was done with it, and I was tired. So I laid down on the couch beside where I'd been working, and I happened to glance up, and this was what I saw. And I went, oh, I'm not done after all. That's the angle that I want. And out of all the photos I took that day of this was the one that worked. So I've now learned to, if when I'm shooting a flower, for example, I'll hold it up higher, I'll hold it down lower, I'll turn it a little bit by degrees and try to get the best perspective or the best point of view to shoot from. And an unusual point of view can add interest to an image. When I shoot ballroom dance like this, I like to isolate certain areas. And so I have a whole collection of dance photographs that are shot like this, where I basically cut the person in half and focused on the area that interested me. Sometimes I'll get a little bit playful with that, as in this shot that I took of elephant toes. I try to show you the subject in a way that you haven't looked at it before. And that's a good thing to keep in mind. How can you portray your subject in a way that's a little different than everybody else's shot of the same thing? Another question to ask yourself is, does the color contribute, or would it be stronger as a monochrome? So this one again is mine, and I'm pretty happy with this. It's very sharp. In fact, it's focus bracketed and focus stacked, so it is sharp from pretty much front to back. It's well composed. It has some beautiful curves, but what really draws me in this image is the light and the curves, not the color. And so I tried it in black and white. And black and white photography is a whole other topic, and it's not just a matter of desaturating the color. But don't be afraid to try your photos in monochrome. You might be surprised at some of them coming out in a way that you like better. If you use Lightroom, all you have to do is press the V key on the keyboard to toggle a black and white view on and off. And that's only a beginning. Then you want to go in and really work the black and white. But taking away color can make lighting and lines and textures and forms stand out more because color tends to grab attention. If you want to learn more about black and white and how to process it, see my tutorial called Black and White, Why and How on my YouTube channel. When I put the two together, for me, the black and white is a clear winner. And it may not be for you, but I think I like the way it highlights the light. Another question for you. Do the orientation and the aspect ratio suit the image? This is another internet image. A good general rule of thumb, and that's a general rule. It'll be broken many times very effectively. But as a general rule of thumb, shoot vertical when your subject is vertical or when the dominant lines are vertical, and shoot horizontal when the subject or the dominant lines are horizontal. And of course, film's cheap these days if you're shooting on a digital camera, so shoot both ways if you're in doubt. And in this image, all this extra background is unnecessary and doesn't contribute to the image. So by changing the aspect ratio and making the subject or the image vertical, I think we improve the image. There are also some distractions here. We know that your eye, the viewer's eye, will always go to the brightest area in the frame. And that's the chair in this image. And that's not what the photographer wants us to look at. They'd been much better off to use a darker colored chair of some kind, probably black or gray or something like that. And the detail in the background is distracting. One way to get around that is to move the model farther away from the backdrop. And the back of the woman's hand is a large, bright area, and it's been distorted by the use of a wide-angle lens to make it look even bigger. When you're shooting with wide-angle lenses, things closer to the camera look bigger. And women's hands are usually shot edge on rather than flat on. So, they've got an attractive model and an interesting expression and not a bad pose, but there are some things here that could be improved. Another question is the framing too loose or too tight, or is it just right? You don't want so much space around the subject that it seems to be floating around in space, but you also need to have a little bit of breathing room for your subject. And how much is somewhat subjective, but play with it and see what feels right for you. Here we have too little headroom. The bird, it seems like it's hitting its head up against the top edge of the frame. And it would be very easy to expand the canvas and use content-aware fill to just add a little more headroom. Or, of course, always better to get it right in camera. Here's a photo of my favorite model, my husband. And I use it to illustrate the point about an appropriate lens and focal length for what you're trying to do. This was shot on the same camera, the same day, just a few minutes apart, but different lenses. The one on the left was shot with a 50mm full frame equivalent, and the one on the right was shot with a 90mm full frame equivalent. Both prime lenses. Notice the facial distortion on the shorter focal length. In the old days of film, 135mm was considered the classic portrait lens length. Now, people tend to consider around 85 to 90 to be the classic portrait lens length. And I quite like the 90mm for that. But ask yourself, would a different lens or a different focal length would it have made a positive difference for your photograph? And very, very crucially, is the visual design effective? And by that, I'm talking about lines and shapes and form, texture, color, negative space, subject placement, visual balance, patterns, point of view, contrast, framing. These are all building blocks of visual design or building blocks of composition. And I'm going to take a little side trip here. And if you're an experienced photographer, this may be, a little bit boring, a little bit stuff you already know. But if you're earlier in your photographic journey, I think this may help you. I wish I'd seen it earlier in my photographic journey. We're going to talk just for a minute about line and shape and how you can use them in a composition. So I'd love to go into a full discussion of composition, but that's about a 3-hour discussion. So we know that lines can be used to lead the eye, and shapes are very effective in organizing a frame. And if we understand the psychology of how people respond to different kinds of lines and shapes, then we can use that understanding to help convey our vision for the image. It's like learning the visual language. So a horizontal line typically conveys a sense of stability, peace, groundedness, calmness. And this may be one of the reasons why seascapes are often calming, because we have vast horizontal lines where the horizon is. And, I'm a prairie girl. Prairie shots can be the same way. Vertical lines tend to give a feeling of growth or strength or height, stature, grandeur. And so if we know that, we can use vertical lines in our compositions. Diagonal lines have more of a feeling of dynamism. They're more energetic, and they may introduce an element of mild tension. Aside from the fact that a tilted horizon just looks wrong, especially if you've got water in the shot, it also changes the feeling of the image. It loses the peace and stability that comes with the horizontal line and starts to have that mild tension because of the diagonal line. Curves of various kinds usually have a feeling that's more relaxed. It may be sensual, fluid. It may suggest movement. And often there's a, quotes, feminine feeling when you've got a curve in your composition. On the other hand, a zigzag line tends to bring about a feeling of excitement, tension, maybe even anxiety. And we can see in this example from Georgia O'Keeffe, the famous American painter, how that works for her in this composition. This is simply called Black Lines. It was painted in 1916. And we've got 3 different kinds of lines here. We've got the horizontal line at the bottom that's quite heavy and gives a feeling of stability. Then we've got a straight up and down vertical line, which gives us that sense of growth or movement upward. And then there's a zigzag line, which introduces a sense of tension. These lines are so simple, and yet they do have an emotional impact. So here's a photo I took in Nanaimo Harbor one day. The lines are pretty much horizontal. The overall impression is horizontal, and there's just simple lines and shape and a touch of color here. And it has that feeling of stability and peace that is often conveyed with a horizontal line. Here are two of my flowers, and I think you'll agree that there's a difference in emotion between the upright line of the stem of the calla lily on the right and the S curve of the stem of the black-eyed Susan on the left. They both have curves, but there's a dignity and a formality to the calla lily and more of a whimsical, playful feeling to the other one. Lines do have an emotional impact. Curves, as I mentioned, can be quite sensual. This is a photograph that I took, oh gosh, 10 years ago, of a calla lily with its leaf behind it. And it reminds me of a female body. So if you want to convey a sense of sensuality, then curves are something you may want to include in your composition. A leading line is a line either literal or implied that leads the viewer into the image, and it can add to a feeling of depth. So here, the bright line of the wave brings your eye to the island buildings and the lighthouse, and the land on the right almost acts like an arrow pointing towards Entrance Island over there. Here we have a curved line of rocks that acts as a leading line. And other examples that you often see in images are like a path in the woods or a road, things like that, that leading lines. And even in an abstract, leading lines can be effective. Here we've got a line that leads up from the upper left into the central focal point of the image. Not all lines are leading lines, only if they lead you into the image. So in this image, the path is a leading line, but the crossbar on the cross is not. It's not leading your eye into the image. And then shapes. Shapes also have certain psychological impact on the viewer. So squares and rectangles are often seen as balanced and solid, secure, orderly, and sometimes, quotes, masculine. If I know that, and I want to create an image with a gentle feminine feeling, then I'm probably going to use curves and avoid rectangles. If I want to create a solid, stable, sort of quotes, masculine feeling image, then I'm probably going to stay away from curves and use more rectangular kinds of forms. Many of my images have a more feminine feel, and you'll notice they have a lot of curves in them. Here's something that I learned from Freeman Patterson in a workshop a few years ago. He really emphasized that when you look at a scene or a subject, break it down into very basic shapes and use those shapes as the foundation of your composition. So this is a photo I call West Coast Blues, and it's really basically two rectangles. And those rectangles contribute to the feeling of peace and stability in the image. Here we have rectangles, but we also have circles of bokeh and the shapes of the hanging droplets. So look for the shapes and the lines in your images and ask yourself, have I used shapes and lines effectively? Do they contribute to what I'm trying to say, or do they fight with the message I'm trying to convey? Circles tend to be calming, happy, carefree, sometimes youthful. This is a picture of my granddaughter taken by her dad. And when you look at pictures of kids, often you'll see circles, hula hoops, balloons, bubbles, balls, bikes. Circles and bright colors and kids go together. Triangles are very dynamic and very attractive. There can be a very powerful shape to use in your compositions. And they don't have to be perfect triangles. Here's a triangle that's not complete in the frame, but our eye and our brain will complete the shape. And shapes can be implied. So here we have an amaryllis bud that I shot a few years ago, and you can see that there are triangles in the amaryllis image. Another shot from a few years ago, this one was published in Photo News Canada, and again, triangles. the major shape in the frame is a triangle. It's an implied triangle, but it's there and it helps the image. And we can see shapes in our subjects, but we can also create shapes. We can use triangles when we're doing portraiture, for example. So one of the sort of rules of thumb in portraiture is if it bends, bend it. So elbows, knees, you want to try to get some triangles into your composition. And if you're shooting a group, rather than putting them in lines, try to arrange them so the heads form triangles. Bend the knees and the elbows for more triangles. And here you've got a whole lot of triangles. Got one there, but there's triangles all over the place. Draw lines between any of those heads and you've got triangles. And then you look at the way the knees are bent and the elbows are bent, and there are triangles everywhere. It's a much more interesting and engaging composition than just a line of people. So that's a very brief look at lines and shapes. There's so much more to composition and visual language, but let's get back to some different questions for evaluating images. So great composition is a wonderful start and it's essential. How's the light in your image? And by this, I'm talking about exposure. Is it appropriately exposed? But also contrast and the way that the light falls in the photo. So this photographer has composed the image quite well with great leading lines and curves and texture, but the light is pretty terrible. He's underexposed the image to keep the sky detail, which is not a bad start, but the whole image is underexposed and it lacks contrast. It would have been a really good idea in this kind of situation to take two exposures, one for the sky and one for the foreground, and then blend them later in post so that both are appropriately exposed. But even without that, working this in post could really help this image. And so it's not my image, but I worked with it just very quickly to show you what could have happened with this. This will show you what a little bit of dodging can do to a photograph. Dodging just simply means selectively brightening the bright areas sorry, I'm tongue-tied tonight, to create contrast and interest. You've heard of dodging and burning. Burning means darkening areas and dodging means lightening them. So if it were my photo, I would take more time and care and do a more precise job. But I think this gives you an idea of the importance of assessing the light in your photograph and making the best of it. There's no such thing as bad light, but there is light that is less than ideal for the subject and the intention. So again, this is an internet shot. Bright sunlight creates dramatic shadows, and it can be really effective for some kinds of subjects, but they're not usually what we want with portraits, especially portraits of women. So this is my beautiful grandniece, and I like to show this one because it shows how the soft diffuse light that you get on an overcast day or in open shade is usually best for portraits. And this kind of soft light is also really good for forest shots and flowers and waterfalls. If you want to go out and shoot forests or flowers or waterfalls, pick an overcast day, and I think you'll find that you get results that you really quite like. Having said that, there are always exceptions. And here the hard light emphasizes the intensity of the portrait. This is Josef Karsch's portrait of Jan Sibelius, the composer. And I can almost hear the music Finlandia when I look at this photograph. The lighting really contributes to the intensity. And so, like I said, there's principles of visual design, and there's a time to use them and a time to maybe change them around. Another photo of sunflowers I did this summer. Indoors, the way you light your subject can make a big difference to the feeling of the image. So I think this is a reasonably good image, and I actually sold a metal print of this not long ago. But by feathering the light across the subject, just directing the light in a way that it illuminates part of the subject and sort of skims across the surface, gives a very different feeling and a very different effect. And when I look at the two of these together, you know, I'm not sure one is better than the other, but I really prefer the one on the right because I find it more visually interesting. So whatever the case, pay attention to the lighting, whether you're creating the light or capturing light that's, natural light. And keep in mind that often if you light only part of a subject, it makes a more interesting image than lighting the whole thing. Another important question to ask yourself is the post-processing effective? And when I'm looking at my post-processing, I'm looking at colors, tones, contrast, detail, all those sorts of things. And many images fall short because the photographer has either done not enough to bring out the best in the image, like that shot I showed you of the rock formation, or because they've over-processed it. So try to be as objective as you can and evaluate whether your post-processing is effective. Does it complement the subject? Is it overdone? Are there halos and artifacts? Look closely. Often, if you look closely and at a photograph, you'll see sort of halos around like the barn roof in this one. And those can be caused by chromatic aberration, which I can see along the line of the roof. There's a green tinge there, easy to get rid of. But you can also get a halo of white if you use too much clarity on an image or just otherwise over-process it. So you want to evaluate, you want to be ruthless with yourself and make sure you do the best you can. Both of these images are oversaturated. These birds, I've never seen one of these birds, but apparently they are not blue, they're gray. And the saturation has been bumped up enough that the little bit of blue that probably came from a cloudy sky has started to yell at us. And the bird one also looks like it's been cropped quite aggressively and then noise reduction applied aggressively as well. So it's kind of oversaturated and soft. I always shoot in RAW, and I really encourage you to do so as well. RAW files are flat by nature. They are literally raw data that you need to process in order to make them look good. If you're shooting JPEG, then your camera does the processing. It makes all the creative decisions for you. So I really encourage you to learn to post-process to convey your vision and be careful not to overdo it. And if you're a beginner and you're just not into post-processing and it's just too much to take on, then I suggest that you shoot RAW plus JPEG. Most cameras will let you do that. And that way you have the RAW file for later. So if you get a wonderful photograph today, and 5 years from now, you want to use that photograph, you may find yourself, as I often have, wishing I had shot in RAW. I have photographs from a trip down the Oregon coast about 11 years ago, and the camera I had at the time didn't shoot RAW. And I really, really wish I had the RAW files for those pictures because I could do so much more with them. So even if you're not into post-processing now, allow for the possibility that you might be in 5 years and you'll want those RAW files. You also want to ask yourself if the post-processing suits the image. So for example, a high key treatment of this portrait that I took a few years ago of this young girl really complements the feeling of youth and innocence. And a dark, low-key approach complements the feeling of mystery and sensuality in my image of a reclining calla lily. If I'd switched that around and made this one high-key and the one of the girl dark, they'd look completely different. And I don't think that the treatment would suit those subjects and the emotion that goes with each of those. One of my heroes, probably like many of you, is Ansel Adams. And I really love this photograph. And I show it to you because I want to make the point that skilled photographers since the very beginning of photography have used post-processing to polish their images. Ansel Adams was a master in the darkroom, and he dodged and burned to create drama in his image. It was old school post-processing. This is probably Ansel Adams' most famous photograph and one of my favorites. I'm sure you know it as well. And you might be surprised to see what it looked like before Ansel Adams did his post-processing, his dodging and burning in the darkroom. This is the contact print for Moonrise Hernandez. That was basically the raw file. That was the negative, the way it came out of the camera. He skillfully manipulated the tones in his image to express his vision. For a long time, I thought he just used a red filter and that's how he got that effect. And he did use a red filter often, but I had a chance to tour the Center for Contemporary Photography in Tucson, Arizona, which Ansel Adams established. And the day I was there, they had an exhibit of the negative, the contact print that you're seeing here, and various prints made from that negative, and they're all a little bit different. So ask yourself, have you done the same thing with your photo that Ansel Adams did with him? Have you post-processed it effectively? And is there anything that you could do in post to make it better, or have you overdone it? Here's the comparison of the content print before the post-processing and what Adams did with it in the darkroom. Now, of course, post-processing was very less precise in the days of darkrooms. I can make the same, I can make 8 prints that look exactly the same from my same digital negative because I have the precision of today's technology. Whereas if you look at 8 of the prints from this negative by Ansel Adams, you will see differences. He also gave the prints he made slightly different interpretations, which we can do in Lightroom and so forth. Ansel Adams said that the negative is the musical score and the print is the performance. And if you've gone to many concerts, you know that the performance of a particular piece of music is never completely identical to the way you heard it the last time. So in terms of self-critique, there's a lot to track, and I really encourage you to use a checklist. I've been doing photography for a long time, pretty successfully, and I still will occasionally use a checklist, although most of the checklist is in my head. So Arif is going to be sending out a checklist to the group. It's a double-sided checklist, and what I suggest is that you print it double-sided and then laminate it and get a dry erase pencil, a dry erase pen, and check off the check boxes as you go down, and then you can erase it and use it for the next print. I suggest that you view your photograph in a variety of formats over a period of time. It can be helpful to either look at a small thumbnail or squint at a photo to evaluate the general composition. And it can also be helpful to print an image and have it hanging on your wall for a little while, maybe on a bulletin board or something, and evaluate it as time goes by and see what you think, or put it on your iPad and review it from time to time. And then accentuate the positive and learn from what doesn't work, and be really, really picky. The more picky you are, the better photographer you're going to be. And mentally critique photos everywhere. We run into photographs online and in magazines and billboards. And so analyze them. Ask yourself what works and what doesn't work in the photographs you see. And go to your favorite images, whether those are paintings or photographs, and see if you could determine what makes them work so well. Look up critiques online. YouTube has critiques. I know a few years ago, Victoria Camera Club was putting videos of their critique sessions online, and they were quite helpful. Hire someone you respect to coach you once in a while. I have an appointment with a coach in a couple of weeks' time. I'm still doing that. Not very often, maybe once every 2 or 3 years, but the feedback that I get from them, I take away and use to improve. I also provide that service for other photographers. And I had a client in Pennsylvania, for example. We had an hour or 2 hour critique session together. And he was a pretty decent photographer. And I said to him when we got near the end of the critique, I said, you know, I'm noticing that I didn't see any vertical compositions in your photographs. They were all horizontal. Tell me about that. Why was that? And he said, oh, I never thought to shoot vertical. And so we had a discussion about vertical orientation versus horizontal and when you might want to use that. And he later sent me some photographs that he'd shot vertically, and they were very strong photographs. So a coach will sometimes see things that you don't see. And I think really, really good idea, probably the best idea out of this list, is to start a critique group. It's very hard to be objective about your own work. And that's where a critique group can be really helpful, especially if you can find a group or create a group with people who are at your level of expertise or higher. So my process when I'm critiquing my photos goes like this. First, I decide from a shoot which photos are worth working on, because they're not all. I process those ones and then I put them away for a little bit. And then I go back to them and I critique them and improve them. Then I copy them to my iPad. When they're as good as I think they're going to get, I put them on my iPad and I go back to them many times. So I do most of my editing sitting at a desk with a computer, but I'll put it on the iPad and I'll sit in an easy chair in the evening and look through, and lo and behold, all of a sudden I'll notice something that I didn't notice when I was at the computer. And when that happens, I email myself that photo and tell with a note saying, check the upper left corner. There's kind of a bright spot there. You might want to tone down. And I keep working my photographs like that. And only after a few months, usually, does a photograph move from my review pile on my iPad into my, this is done pile. And then once I've done all that work myself, then I may very well take the photograph to my critique groups. And especially if I feel that it's just not quite right yet, but I don't know what it needs. But I need to do my own work first and then take it to the critique group. If you think about any sports hero, Wayne Gretzky, Shohei Ohtani, Michael Jordan, Muhammad Ali, any sports hero that you can think of, ask yourself how they got that good. Well, it wasn't by being constantly praised and told how wonderful they were. They might have got some of that. Of course, you need some of that to be encouraged. But they worked very, very hard and they received a ton of coaching and critique. They got encouragement, yes, but they got very specific constructive feedback and they pushed themselves to excel. I love this meme. I want to encourage you, please don't join a critique group if what you really want is just to show off your work and be praised for it. That's not the purpose of a critique group. You can have a photo sharing group, and that's great, but unless you're really willing to roll up your sleeves and do the hard work of analyzing the weaknesses and the strengths in your work, then you're not going to get any better. One of the groups that I belong to, there's kind of a split. About half the people in the group are really interested, and I'm not talking about our SIG, so none of you need to take this personally. About half of the people in the group really want critique. They ask for it, they receive it, they listen to it, and they use it. And those are the ones who are growing. The ones who don't really want to hear critique, they basically are standing still and not getting any better. I do love this meme. Some of the best advice I've been given is don't take criticism from people you would never go to for advice. And I think that's really good. But this meme also applies to praise. It's always nice to hear praise and we want to receive it graciously, but don't take it too seriously if the person doesn't know much about photography. All you need to do is look through Facebook one day and see all of the comments about, stunning photograph, amazing, blah, blah, blah. And they're not stunning, amazing photographs, but the people who saw them really liked them. But that's not the people who are going to help you get better. Enjoy that praise when it comes, but that's not what's going to help you get better. So if you're interested in forming a critique group, here's some ideas. You want to have, I think, about 6 to 8 people. The group I've been running for 7, 8 years has about 8 people in it. And we meet for 2 hours and cover about 3 photographs, sometimes 3, 4, maybe 5 per person per meeting. And that's about right to give enough attention and enough critique to each person's image. And then start by asking the photographer to talk about the image. You want to know why they took it, what they're happy with, what they're not happy with. What was their reason? What did they want to say with the photograph? Because that's when you'll understand what they're trying to accomplish, and you need to understand that in order to help them get better. I will sometimes ask for feedback before I speak about a photograph. I'll take my image to the group and just say, I'm going to hold off on comments. I'd like to hear your initial reactions. Because if I want feedback on the emotional impact and I tell them what emotional impact I was going for, that's going to color their answer. And I really need to hear sometimes what people take away from it. And then, be really open to suggestions and try out the suggestions if you possibly can in Lightroom. Some of my groups do this and some don't. And I find I get a lot more out of the ones where we actually, if somebody says, what if you happen to just crop in a little bit on the left side? Thanks, Irene. Then we actually do it and we can see, yeah, that improves it. Or no, I don't think so. And that helps us get to more of the meat of the critique. So in a critique group, we both give feedback and receive it. So let's look at both of those things. How to offer critique first. I think the most important things are to be respectful, sincere, and helpful. Respectful should go without saying. There's really never any excuse for being rude or hurtful, and yet sometimes people are. You want to be thoughtful and respectful when you offer feedback. You want to be sincere. And, I think we tend to want to be nice. And yeah, nice is good. And we want to be nice, but we also want to be sincere. I trust feedback much more from people who are willing to say when they think something doesn't work in one of my images. It doesn't mean I have to agree with that, but if somebody only offers me positive comments, it's really not as helpful. And it often makes me wonder whether they're really being honest. So, for example, I belong to a group with Heidi and another gal. Heidi's a visiting guest from Boise, Idaho tonight. Nice to have you here, Heidi. She's presented to our club before. And there are 3 of us who meet regularly. And in that group, we know each other pretty well now. We're all at a similar level of expertise. And we will say to each other, this one's not working for me. And we try to be more specific than that. And we might say, I think it's that bright spot in the upper right corner and maybe that line going off to the left. We try to home in on what isn't working, but we don't just say, oh, that's beautiful and move on. We might say, yes, that's beautiful, and then offer a suggestion. And you want to be kind and helpful and encouraging. By themselves, just saying, oh, I love it, or wow, that's stunning. That's nice to hear, but it's not real helpful. So talk about the specifics of what works and doesn't work. You want to respect the photographer's vision and help them accomplish that vision. That's why you ask them, what were you trying to accomplish with this? It's not your photo. And so it's not helpful to say, well, if that were my photo, I'd do blah, blah, blah. You want to ask them, what was your vision? And if they don't have a vision, sometimes people don't, then encourage them to think about that. Ask what they were drawn to, what they felt with the subject or the scene, and then make suggestions that might help them achieve that image or that vision in the image. Be very specific. Talk about things like color palette, lighting, lines, shapes, point of view, all those things on the checklist. And, if you form a critique group, I urge you to have that checklist in front of you when you're meeting with your critique group, because it'll help you give more helpful feedback. And if you can start with talking about what works in the image, that conveys your respect, and the photographer is going to be more likely to receive your suggestions for improvement if you can start on a positive note and end on a positive note too, if you can. Make your feedback specific, and I like to show rather than tell whenever I can. And another important point, I think, is to tailor your comments to the artist. If I'm critiquing for a beginner, I tend to be even more gentle, and I'm not going to tell them all 87 things that they need to fix in the photo. I'm going to tell them the 1 or 2 most important. And because I want to encourage them, I want to help them to get better. And if you just blast somebody with all the things that don't work, that is just going to make them quit. So here's an image by Heidi Eggerman, who's become a wonderful friend of mine. And Heidi is a masterful light painter. She takes photographs in a dark room and lights them with a flashlight that she moves around. It's a skill, and Heidi's given a talk to our club, I think it was last year, on how to do this. The better the artist, the more nitpicking my feedback is going to be. So when I critique Heidi, it's tough, guys. There's not a lot here that doesn't work. So I might talk about the lighting is absolutely exquisite. The arrangement and composition are wonderful. It's very balanced. The color palette is gorgeous. She has a real eye for putting colors together. The background is wonderful. It doesn't distract from the subject, and this is kind of Heidi's style. It works well for her. The focus is very sharp, and yet she's added a glow in post that really adds to the emotion of the feel of the photograph. So how the heck do you critique something like this? Well, Heidi and I have become good friends, and we do this every week for each other pretty much. And so, you know, my one suggestion with this was that the pumpkin stem is pointing out of the frame. And if she just turned that pumpkin around and had the stem pointing into the frame, I think she'd be darn near perfect. And, you know, Heidi's the kind of person who takes that feedback. She'll go away and try it and decide whether she likes that better or not. So if you're getting really picky for critique from me in the critique group, guys, it's because I respect your work. Lastly, be encouraging. Try to finish on a sincere and positive note. As a critiquer, your job is to help the photographer create more effective work. So encourage them, suggest things they can try to make their work better, help them understand what's working and what isn't. And then the other side of the coin is receiving feedback. First of all, consider the source. I will listen to all feedback on my work, but I tend to take it more seriously based on the expertise of the person offering it. It's kind of like that meme that I showed you. Ask yourself, no matter who's offering the critique, are there any specifics that you could actually use? There's an old proverb that says a wise person learns more from a fool than a fool learns from a wise person. And I've always liked that expression. I don't care who's offering me critique, there might be a nugget of gold in it. And so I do want to consider it carefully. Clarify if necessary. You want to make sure you understand what the critiquer is offering you. Try out the suggestions. I've been in critique groups from time to time where somebody's made a suggestion and I thought, I don't really think that's going to fit for me. But after the meeting, I'll go and try it and I'll go, by golly, you know, I think I do like that better. I think it is more effective this way. So try it, even if you don't think it's going to be right for your image. And then use the suggestions only if they reflect what you wanted for the image. Weigh the feedback. Think about whether it fits for you. Very often it will, and you'll be able to use it. But if it doesn't fit, then just accept it in the spirit of the person trying to help you improve and just set it aside. Resist the impulse to get defensive. You are the artist, and the final judgment is yours. And I want to share, I think, this one more image. And this is from my dear friend Trish Hanna, who's been a member of our club for a while now. Trish is a very skilled artist in several different media. She does fabric art, she does painting, she does photography, and she uses her trained eye to create images that express her vision. And I have a great deal of respect for Trish's work. She brought this image of that she took along the Seine River in Paris to one of our critique groups. And I really like this image. I love the contrast between what's going on in the street and what's taking place on the steps. I love that dynamic between the top and the bottom. And for me, the guy at the top of the steps who's looking up at the street just ties it all together. I like this image like this. But that wasn't Trish's vision for the piece. And she is the artist. It's her image and it's her vision that matters. So she took the feedback from the group, and you know, the feedback I've just voiced is part of what she heard in the critique group. This is what she did with the image. And I always laugh when I see this image, because one of the first things I learned in photography was don't cut people's heads off. And that's exactly what Trish has done here. She took the guy that I liked so much looking at the street and just chopped him off at the neck. And that was her vision. And I think it works. It's different from what I would have done, but it's not my photograph. So you get to decide what best expresses your vision. When I critique, I try to offer gentle, respectful, but really candid feedback that's actually useful in helping my client improve. And while I offer an educated opinion, it's not the only opinion, and it might not fit for my client. So I encourage you to approach critiquing in the same kind of spirit. Offer helpful feedback, listen to the feedback that you get, weigh it, use it or not, and be true to your vision. So that's my advice on critiquing. And I know it's a lot, and that's where I think that the checklist that Arif is going to send you will help. Another resource that I really want to mention to you is, I think this is the best book I've ever read on photography. It's called The Heart of the Photograph, 100 Questions for Making Stronger, More Expressive Photographs. And it's by David Duchemin, who lives up in Nanuus. And he's got several books. This one I particularly like. And he has 100 questions and a narrative about those questions that I think can help any photographer improve. So if you only buy one photography book, I think this is the one to buy. In closing, I have a number of presentations I offer to camera clubs, and several of them, the ones in red, are on my YouTube channel. This one will be going on my YouTube channel within a short time. Give me a few days to get it up there on the channel. And I would urge you, if any of those subjects interest you, have a look, and maybe it can help you get better. I also invite you to have a look at my website. I redid my website this summer, and it has some new work on it, along with some helpful articles and some links to my YouTube tutorials as well. And that's at jhhphoto.com. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. And by George, I think I got in under the wire, Arif, and prepared to take some questions. So I'll stop my sharing and